Thanks everybody. It's great to see everybody here all across North America. After a couple of years of COVID, I feel like I haven't really talked to anybody in a long time. So it's great to jump back in. Okay. So yeah, I'm Bryn Davidson, co-owner of Lanefab Design Build. We are based in Vancouver, British Columbia. It's September of 2022, and I want to enlist all of you to join in our little effort to try and turn the equinox into the day that everybody changes their filters. After a decade of building high performance homes for clients, you can spend thousands of hours, scrutinizing an energy model, and then you go to your client's house and they haven't changed the filters in 3 years, and the thing's about to keel over and die. So twice a year, we try to get everybody that we know to change their filters. So anyway, that's my first little plug. So with our company, we started Lanefab in 2009. And for those who are not from Vancouver, the name is branded around this idea of what we call a laneway house, because in 2009, Vancouver made those legal across the city. And that's basically a small little house that you can put at the back of your property next to the alley, or in Vancouver, they call them a laneway. So other people call them accessory dwellings or coach house or whatever. So in the beginning, when we started off, we were quite literally a design build, in that here we are mixing up some concrete by hand to build this very first laneway house in the city of Vancouver back in 2009, 2010. At the time, we really wanted to have a green building system that we could do on every single project, so that we weren't doing 5 code minimum and then 1 green building. We wanted a system we could do on every project. So this first little laneway house had, super insulated walls and triple glazed and all those kind of things that you're familiar with. And we kind of spun that into a standardized system that we started using on all of our projects. At the time, this was new. There was this huge lineup around the block. People were very curious about this new type of dwelling. So from there, we went on to build more than 100 of these things all throughout the city of Vancouver. This is another laneway house, same kind of building systems. Another laneway house, this one was solar and heat pumps and things like that. More with rainwater capture, all sorts of things. Great little fun projects, modestly sized, mostly infill behind existing homes. And in the process of doing this thing that was fairly new, we were able to drum up some decent press over the years. And from there, re-expand back into doing full-size homes, but using the same kind of green building systems that we were doing with the laneway houses. So we went forward, same kind of thing, always trying to tinker and try and push the envelope within our own little world of trying to figure out what to do. And so we did a number of these homes. This one's a wheelchair accessible home throughout Vancouver. And after several years of doing this, we started hearing about this thing called passive house. And in the beginning, like everybody, you're like, well, passive solar, passive house, what is that? We started playing around with the PHPP a little bit and started sort of tinkering with this to kind of see where that would go in terms of integrating that with our current sort of system that we'd been building up on our own. We brought that into ideas like this is a renovation addition to an Arthur Erickson house in North Vancouver. But eventually we decided to really make a wholesale shift from this kind of weird mishmash of things that we've been making up on our own, just making shit up, into the much more rigorous and structured world of passive house. And you discover that there's all these other great people around the world working with the same system. And there's a lot of great, because of that, there are a lot of ideas that you can share and build off of. You can constantly, this community is constantly building off of each other to push things forward, as opposed to other green building sort of systems where everybody's just sort of tinkering, trying this and that and whatever. So it has been a great sort of introduction and a way to sort of change what we do, but also meet a lot of good folks. So yeah, over time, eventually we started down the path of certifying passive houses to the international standard, mostly in Vancouver. And I'll say mostly in Vancouver because one of the compelling reasons we've been able to do this and make it standard for all of our projects is because of the collaboration we've had with the City of Vancouver green building staff and the kind of programs they've put in place at the city level. First, to remove barriers, and then to actually provide incentives, whether those are cash incentives or zoning incentives, that make it just that much easier to kind of take a client who's never heard of Passive House and have them say, oh yeah, let's just do it. And so that's what we've been doing for the last, I don't know, 7 or 8 years or whatever it's been. This is the East 37th Passive House, a 33-foot lot, a house with a secondary suite in the basement, facing south. We always had a strong interest in kind of mid-century modern and kind of West Coast modern and some of the LA case study houses, but those LA case study houses are pretty terrible from a thermal envelope point of view. So, we're always trying to bring together a lot of these ideas of indoor, outdoor, and transparency and modernism and blend it with the science of Passive House. This is a Passive House with a basement suite and a laneway house together. This was pretty modest by Vancouver cost standards, cheaper than a lot of the code minimum houses getting built in Vancouver. We built the first certified Passive House in New Westminster. This is a 1-story. The first certified Passive House in Burnaby. This is just a single family house. It's an east-west lot, so we're aiming to actually capture sun from the side, and so the massing of this house and the overhangs and everything kind of unfold directly from those kind of Passive House ideas. This is a pair of Passive Houses that we built in Vancouver. Each of these has a secondary suite and then also a laneway house at the back. So these are 2 lots together, and we ended up with 3 dwellings where 2 little old bungalows had sat before. Same ideas in terms of building envelope and shading and everything else, but in a sort of more sort of quasi-traditional sort of package compared to some of what we've been doing. At the other end of the sort of aesthetic spectrum, we had a client really wanted something boxy and modern. This is, again, another Passive House with a basement suite and a laneway house, so 3 dwellings on a single lot. On a very difficult east-west site, you can see that house to the left. They actually have this illegal sort of addition on the top of their roof, and I think that was killing about a full kilowatt, I think, off of our annual heat demand. And so we were really struggling with, how do you make Passive House work in these kind of difficult urban situations? It's definitely not the house on the hill that you see where it's sort of perfectly oriented to capture whatever sun you want. In more recent years in British Columbia, they've adopted what they call the step code. So they have a step code 1 to 5, and step code 5 is sort of roughly equivalent to Passive House at a broad brush level. And this is a really great system because it gives municipalities a roadmap of kind of where they can go. It also gives builders a roadmap of where you're going to be going as the building code becomes more stringent going forward with each coming year. So some builders are like, crap, we've got to now build to step code 3. Other folks say, well, let's just jump to step code 5 or Passive House because that's the finish line. Once we figure out how to do that, then we can coast because that's where we need to be. So I think this sort of roadmap, the step code system has been great. So this is in North Vancouver. This is a step code 5 house. A lot of all the same kind of systems and products that we were putting into a Passive House, but just going through a different kind of certification. This is a Passive House on a skinny 25-foot lot with I guess we'll call it a so-called garage. The City of Vancouver required a single parking space. It's probably the only garage with a trifold triple glazed Passive House folding door as part of the building envelope. So you know, these urban sites are definitely a challenge, and working with the zoning constraints is a challenge, but it is interesting, and we can generally have a system now that we can take and apply it to just about any property, and more or less make it work. I was sort of also throwing in this picture because one of the things that we've been wrestling a lot with, like everybody, compared to when we started, is this issue of overheating. And I know when we first started building in Vancouver, we never even thought about it. You just open the windows at night and the house cools down and it's all great. But now with the shifting climate and these extreme heat events, we can't be that lazy anymore. So this one picture, we've got the fixed shading, the overhangs on the south side. We've got the active shading, which is this sort of mechanical awning that extends to cover that upper floor patio. And then we also have active cooling in the form of an air source heat pump that's serving this. And so that's a package of things that we're putting on almost all of our projects now. But I think it is important to recognize that only 2 of those also work during a power outage. So, you know, whether you're in Texas or California or wherever, going forward, our extreme heat events are going to be increasingly coupled with grid problems. And so I think we all know how well Passive House does in the winter if there's a power outage. But I think we also need to wrestle with in the summer how we deal with our shading strategies. And I know in our office, we've gotten to be much more sensitive to that in a way we weren't 5 years ago. So I alluded a little bit to some of the rules in terms of how we make Passive House scalable, because for us, we find only maybe a third of our clients walk in the door knowing what Passive House is. And then maybe the other third are interested when we tell them. And the last third really don't give a damn. You know, they come to us because they like the design and they like the general approach. And so if we can just do Passive House in a way that's cost competitive or compelling in terms of its benefits, then they just go along with that. So that's always been our goal, is to make it so that we can do this on every single project without question, so that we're not going through this kind of awful ROI conversation of how much does this cost versus payback period and blah, blah, blah. I hate that conversation, because it's really mostly a way that people are just masking their discomfort with doing something unusual. And once you've done a number of these things and shown that it's not weird, they're generally okay with that. But a big part of what helps is if your local city is on board with supporting this initiative. So what I've got here is an example of 4 different scenarios of a 33-foot lot in Vancouver. And on the far right, we can see we call FSRs the same as FAR. It's a measure of density. But basically, we're getting a density bonus now if we build either to the certified Passive House or the certified net zero standard. And so this becomes a really compelling feature for that last third of folks who really don't care about Passive House. They don't care about climate. They don't care about any of that stuff. They want a nice house. They want it to cost competitive. And if you can get bonus square footage, that can really sell it. So on our typical property in Vancouver, 33-foot lot, these are the different sizes that you can get. With the Passive House, the certified project, we're getting about an 18 to 20% bump. So that's an extra 600 square feet, which is enough space for some extra, revenue suites or whatever. If you look in Vancouver at a market value of $1,000 a square foot, as a rule of thumb, that's about $600,000 of value that comes from upgrading to Passive House. And the cost to upgrade is maybe 80 grand or something like that. So it becomes a bit of a no-brainer, for at least for us, for people that are familiar with this type of system. And so everybody coming in the door, we can say, let's go do this. What has been interesting in the last year or two, though, is that the incentive that they're offering is being offered either for Passive House or certified net zero. And so we've started jumping into this interesting conversation that building nerds are really into: passive house versus net zero, blah, blah, blah. And I would say, after now cranking through a number of these projects, we're seeing that the net zero, it is an easier and lazier path. I don't really have to be that rigorous with my concept design. I can kind of do and design almost anything, and make it work. The big thing for a lot of these is that net zero we can do with a slightly thinner wall, which means out of our given floor area, we get a little bit of extra usable floor area. Now, at the end of the day, is it a better building? I don't think so. I think net zero has a problem in that it has a heavily kind of what I would call a suburban bias, in that if you do a really spread out rancher house with a big roof, it's quite easy to do net zero. You can do a really crappy building and throw enough solar on it and call it net zero. It's not like passive house where it's actually a guarantee of doing a quality building. But when we go into an urban setting where we are doing higher density, multiple units with small roofs, net zero becomes a real challenge. And so you see the ways that, passive house plus is much better adapted for kind of urban sort of building typologies versus net zero, where we end up doing these solar carports or whatever, because we just frankly don't have enough roof space for all the solar that you need. Then, there's also issues like, okay, in BC, we have clean energy. Should we be incentivizing solar? All these sort of debates back and forth. And they're worthy debates, but at the end of the day, they're not necessarily the most interesting thing to me. I want to look at a project from the big picture level and say, is our project making a difference in the fight against climate change, in addition to being beautiful and being a good home for people? So this is where, for the last, Sean was talking about the TEDx talk that I did back in 2014, which laid out our kind of roadmap for how we wanted to push beyond passive house, beyond harm reduction, to having projects that actually had a measurably positive impact on the climate. And this is not an easy thing to do, but in short, if we can get to net positive, then every project we do is actually beneficial. And what we found is, doing these kind of infill projects where we were actually replacing old, fossil fuel burning homes with higher density homes that were efficient, zero carbon. We provided a place where people could actually drive less versus living in the suburbs. You put all these things together and you could actually have your project create a net reduction in CO2 on the planet, which is kind of the goal that we're aiming for. So to kind of sum that up in kind of the short version, I would generally say that if you've got two passive house projects and one of them is a renovation or it's an infill building, if it's walkable, it's going to have a better impact at a holistic level than a certified passive house that's on a green field or one that's in a rural location. There's nothing wrong with building those. Those can be fantastic projects as well. But in terms of their collective impact, if we look at systems and what we should be scaling up, there is a huge difference between those two types. And so it's been great to see over the last 5 or 6 years, there's been this big shift away from these early adopter projects, on the house on the hill, to these urban projects, large multifamily projects. And I think that that's really important. There's the other piece. Sometimes in Vancouver, we will see a certified passive house, and we're very excited about this. But then you look at the section drawing, and it's got like 5 floors of underground parking or something like that. And I'm like, oh my God, this is what I've come to call the kind of iceberg, the carbon iceberg, in that the majority of the impact of that project is hidden below where you don't see it. So when we look at these projects, another thing I've started to look at as we all talk more about embodied carbon, is not just the materials, but also the choices that unfold from things like minimum parking requirements and zoning stuff. So to the extent that we can be building really great low carbon passive house projects with minimal UCS underground car stuff, I think that that's really the way to go. And we need our city planners on board in terms of helping with that. Of course, materials. I think when I did the talk in 2014, I didn't even talk about embodied carbon at all. Like many of us, it was sort of a third order issue, and I think it's really come much more to the fore. And I think it's quite clear that if we're looking for a holistic impact, some of these things, especially crop residues like straw, really have an ability to do some pretty amazing things. And so I say crop residue just because it is, in my mind, better than the one that gets more hyped, which is mass timber. Mass timber is way better than concrete and steel, but it's not some kind of magical, get out of jail free card like some architects talk about it. I think something like 13% of that tree that gets cut down actually ends up being used in the building. So don't quote me on the exact number, but basically, it's not like your mass timber house is magically better for the climate than a forest. So I just want to say that, there are some really interesting things happening with crop residues, with much more sort of urban projects like this. This is 8 floors of straw bale in France. This is not your hippie straw bale project. As much as those things can be fun, they're not scalable. So these types of things are where I start to get excited. So then, oh, sorry here. Oh, there we go. Thinking about what the next decade holds. For us, we started building laneway houses, then single family. Now we're doing duplexes, passive house, net zero, all this kind of stuff. Going forward, there's the kind of 3 things that are sort of twigging my interest at the moment. And we talked a little bit about some of these low carbon materials, but the other 2 is really talking about zoning and some of these code issues, because that's where we take all of our individual projects and we try and figure out how to collectively scale those up so that they aren't just sort of these glorious one-offs, but something that becomes the standard practice for everybody going forward. So when I look at this, the things I'm excited about are scalable infill zoning and point access blocks. I love this chart. You guys can see this is ADUs, accessory dwelling units, permits issued in Los Angeles. And basically, they were struggling. And then all of a sudden, there was this massive jump. And what happened is that they, in 2017, passed a statewide law overriding local municipalities and forcing them to allow accessory dwellings. And it just shows that how much that housing demand is just being held back by really restrictive zoning rules that are micromanaged at the municipal level. And, I've gone around and talked to cities all over North America about accessory dwellings. And believe me, I am fed up having that same conversation 100 times over. What we really need to be doing is changing our zoning at the state and provincial level so that the things that we need to build that are good for housing, good for climate, can happen and can happen at scale. So if anybody's fired up about this, that's where I want to put my energy. City by city, not so much. Another thing that's sort of interesting just in the last couple of years is this idea of point access blocks, which is something that's incredibly common in Europe and other places outside of North America. But it's basically a type of multifamily housing where your units are wrapped around a single stair core. And that's in contrast to the typical North American approach, which requires 2 egress stairs. And because you have 2 egress stairs, you have a connecting corridor. And because you have a connecting corridor, you have these double loaded units. And the buildings have very big footprints and no cross ventilation and all these other kind of problems. And so it's a really interesting thing in terms of how our urban form really is unfolding from this sort of simple requirement around egress. And so there are a lot of municipalities at the moment that are starting to look at how we could maybe change that, because from a climate point of view, if we want to build these sort of ultra low carbon cities of the future, There are great examples of how we can build this sort of 3 to 8 stories. Only about 50% site coverage, so we've got a lot of green space and permeability. Much lower site coverage than a typical North American multifamily project, especially if you don't have an underground parkade. And so I think when you put all these things together, you have this kind of toolkit for how we start to envision the sort of evolution of our cities going forward. So my goal, at least over the next decade, is to try and figure out how to bring all of these things together along with the passive house learning and the low embodied materials, all that kind of stuff. We've been doing prototypes to try and figure out how these sort of small scale multiplexes can be brought into all of our neighborhoods in Vancouver, so that it's not just shoving multifamily housing onto the polluted arterials where it's busy and noisy and polluted, but saying that these are the true green buildings that should be part of every neighborhood in every city. And so we've been trying to figure out this kind of incremental approach that's passive, doesn't rely on underground parking, can be much more accessible, all these kind of things. We've been looking at different scenarios with or without side yard, blah, 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 lots of different details. But I think we've got an election coming up in a month, and we're going to see at that whether this is something that the city, kind of wants to grab onto. But I think either way, just like we have a step code that shows you where the building code is going, with our zoning, we have a roadmap of where our zoning needs to go. And so we hope that what Vancouver is doing can once again be seen as a kind of roadmap for other cities. We did this little mock-up for one of the local political parties. This is one of the richest mansion districts in Vancouver, and we dropped a bunch of passive house plexes on it just to kind of poke at the system a little bit. So we enjoy doing this kind of thing. This is also, one of the expensive neighborhoods in the west side of Vancouver, where we're looking at how these kind of incremental approaches to densification can kind of slide in there amidst everything else. So I am going to leave it there, but I am excited about what the next decade holds, and I'm excited that so many people are all wrestling with the same challenges. So thanks a lot.